Union. Upon arrival, healthcare is crucial. Children will need psychosocial care. Many will have missed out on proper nutrition. Standard pediatric vaccinations will be prioritized, and the Commission is supporting the supply of vaccines through HERA. Inside Ukraine, genuine humanitarian corridors must be established to evacuate the most vulnerable. We are providing substantial humanitarian aid, work with our international partners, and in coordination with Ukrainian authorities to ensure humanitarian aid reaches its destination and that children can receive protection. This war will mark the children of Ukraine for life. We will not leave a stone unturned to ensure that they will be well cared for, that they can recover and be a child again. This is not only a job, it is our collective responsibility and a human imperative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Šuica, and I now give the floor to Commissioner Ylva Johansson.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning. Putin's army has so far killed a reported 158 children in Ukraine and wounded many more. Last month, Russian soldiers shot Matvey, 8 years old, and his little brother, 4-year-old Klim, and their mother, Margarita, as they tried to escape the hell of Bucha. These war crimes must not go unpunished. Eurojust and Europol will have a key role to play here. About 2 million children escaped Ukraine with their lives. Many children now face a new danger. A danger I warned of here in plenary last time we met here in Strasbourg, nearly 1 month ago, the danger of trafficking. Your resolution shows that you share my concerns. Lithuanian authorities are investigating possible trafficking of 43 children for adoption. There are no confirmed cases yet, but we know from bitter experience that the danger is real. Children are at the top of our agenda, key among the 10 priorities I presented at the Extraordinary Council last week. Priorities for welcoming people fleeing the war. Our aim to protect children from war zone to safe home. Last month, Member States pledged to welcome more than 15,500 Ukrainian refugees from Moldova. 512 have now arrived in the EU, many of them children. My services are working on standard operating procedures for transferring unaccompanied minors between Member States, making clear when registering, relocating, referring children, we must never forget they are children and keep their best interest in mind. The EU Agency for Asylum will play a central role. We are working with the agency on common guidance and standards. And I cannot praise UNICEF enough for their great job they are doing protecting children in the EU and in Ukraine. And since day one, I've been working to prevent trafficking, starting at the EU border, where 282 Frontex staff are helping to identify people at risk from trafficking. Europol is gathering intelligence, coordinating police cooperation, monitoring online activities by potential traffickers and by people trying to exploit the services of victims. Europol has set up a specific task force against trafficking in human beings to work with law enforcement in Ukraine and in EU countries along the border. Many member states are warning against the dangers of trafficking with websites and hotlines, handing out leaflets at train stations, increasing police presence. Our Agency for Law Enforcement Training, CEPOL, is teaching border guards, police and others to identify potential victims and traffickers. We issued calls to use our EU funds to prevent and fight trafficking and support victims. Last July, I appointed Diane Smith as EU anti-trafficking coordinator. Right away, in the first week of war, she activated a network of national rapporteurs against trafficking of human beings, and they have already met twice. She visited Romania, Poland, together with your intergroup on children's rights, and she's doing a very important job in these days. Our priority now is registration, registration, registration. We need to know where these children are, all 2 million. Not one child can go missing. The member states need to step up on registration. EU-LISA is starting technical work to put in place a platform so the member states can exchange information, a platform for registration. We also need to register providers of housing and transport so refugees know who is safe, who they can trust. As my colleague Dubravka, Vice President Suica just said, we have set up the Solidarity Platform to coordinate efforts. It had met twice a week since the war started. Soon, the Solidarity Platform will meet in a session dedicated to protecting children, to discuss issues member states can only address together. How to trace children, boosting registration in member states of arrival and destination, reception capacities for children, also children with disabilities, cooperation with Ukrainian authorities, and to endorse an action plan against trafficking of human beings, we must also work on family reunification. Honourable members, our great challenge still lies ahead of us. The longer this war goes on, the greater the risk to children. And just imagine that you are a Ukrainian mother or father, looking at your 3 children, having to take a very, very difficult decision. Should we keep the children here, where we know they are in danger? Or should we send them with our friend and her 2 children, who will leave soon, on a potential also dangerous journey to the European Union, and knowing the risk that this might be the last time we see our children? So many Ukrainian parents have been forced to take this very, very difficult decision. These Ukrainian parents want us to keep their children safe. They count on us. So let's show them that they can count on us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Johansson. And now we go to the representatives of the different political groups, starting with the EPP group, Eva Kopacz.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, the Commission, for taking up the issue. Regrettably, the Council is not present. 1 year ago, we discussed the first strategy for the rights of children, and now we lack words to talk about the harrowing images from Ukraine. Bucha is the latest place where new horrors took place. One cannot find words to describe that. Every second child in Ukraine has left their homes. They don't sleep in their beds. They don't go to school. Very often they have been separated from their families and friends. Today we will be emphasizing that we need to ensure children's rights to education and other rights. And We should ensure to these children all that the Russian aggression deprived them of. We must protect those children that are not being protected. Children, unaccompanied minors, orphans, but we must not be naive. There will be also people that will want to use the victims of this war, and therefore we need an effective system of registration of children, because how can we support and protect children that we don't know of? And we must not commit errors. We must do more, because the Ukrainians are now entrust us with their children and young people. This is our great responsibility, also to make sure that these children can return to their families, and that they learn about the values of Europe, values that should always be protected.
Kopacz. Next, for the S&D Group, Irache Garcia Perez.
Gracias.
Ďakujem, vážená pani predsednička, dámy.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, President. We are hearing every day worse and worse news from Ukraine, and we're not talking about what's happening at the front either. What is really terrible is that the horrific atrocity.
A tento scenár,
this macabre scene on the streets, it seems day by day there's a fight between humanity and evil. We can still see before our very eyes the bombing of a hospital in Mariupol where pregnant women and babies were killed. These are crimes that we shall not give up on until we have found those who are guilty. But we have to try and mitigate the worst things, the crazy events stemming from Mr. Putin's actions. Children shouldn't have to experience war, and we have to try and bring this to a close as soon as possible. But 7.5 million children who lived in Ukraine have now had to leave their homes, and their lives have changed from one day to the next. Some have to go into hiding, some have to leave their cities, some have to go to other countries. Maybe they have to even leave their families, their parents, their grandparents. The EU can and must help these people, regardless of the situation they find themselves.
ček opatrení.
Need measures to
Prosím.
that people's childhood is being protected together with the government of Ukraine. We need drinking water, accommodation, we need hygiene products, many more aspects as well. But let's not forget that these are children and need places to play, to continue going to school, psychosocial support, and also moving on to the humanitarian corridors. We cannot allow that there are those people who are fleeing are being killed in cold blood. The EU has to work with international organisations to make sure that people can be evacuated in a safe way and that these people are protected. These people are particularly vulnerable, of course, and susceptible to mafia groups which are active there. And they're also volunteers, of course, who are going to stations to pick people up to help. But there are some people who just pretend that they're there to help, and then later they exploit children and women. So the authorities have to be involved as well. So these huge streams of people need to be taken care of, but we need to try and harness the goodwill that exists, but at the same time have to make sure that no woman and no child ends up in the hands of those who would do them ill. Given what we're trying to do in the EU and this platform for solidarity, there's some good things being done. The exchanges between the EU and the agencies, the EU and others, are being facilitated, and of course we have to work on looking at the UN Convention for Children, which has been ratified by the Russian Federation at the time. So children have to be protected, and we have to make sure that we consider the well-being of all children, and not to forget the aspects of human rights that pertain to this. You might think it seems unattainable, but we have to try and build a world with peace, solidarity, and we need to show that this is possible, and we hope that the politicians in Russia will understand that soon too.
On behalf of the Renew Group, I invite Hilde Woutmans to take the floor.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Since the 24th of February, there's just one thing that we're looking at, and that is the horror of the war in Ukraine. We see it as we get up in the morning and as we go to bed at night. And we've seen the terrible pictures from the maternity hospital in Mariupol, and then now we're seeing these terrible images of the bloodbath in Barucha. Millions of people are fleeing, and I want to take my responsibility also as the chair of the Intergroup for Children, and I'd like to thank you, President, because, Commissioner, because you had the courage to go to the spot to show that Europe cares. Thank you very much for being there on behalf of all of us, President. And I'm also very happy that this session is mainly about Ukraine. Yesterday we were looking at the need to make CITES stricter. Now we're talking about protecting children. You know that there are 10,000 unaccompanied minors who've gone missing in Europe. And now we're hearing from Child Focus that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, 2,000 minors are missing. Where are they?
Dat is onze plicht.
It is our duty to look for those children. We know that they're fleeing. We know that they're in another European country, in Poland. I hope that they are safe, but I fear that some of them are dead. It is the proof of a society how it deals with weak people. So let's show who we are. We're late. We need to register. We need to make sure that they get child-friendly information. We have to make sure that they're looked after. We have to make sure that their parents are found. That is our duty. We have European instruments. Let us beef them up.
The passion for this debate that we have. If we were living in Ukraine, if it were our children who were on the run, don't you want people to protect them? Yes, I have 2 children. Let's protect the children. And I want to conclude with a citat of a great woman, Madeleine Albright. The bottom line is that a person who flees his or her home does not shed the right to be treated with dignity and respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Woutmans. And now on behalf of the Greens Group, Saskia Brikmont.
Madame la Commissaire.
Hvala lepa. Madam Commissioner, maybe it's not children that are being targeted, but it's children who are being killed. And this underscores the cruelty of war, violence, exile. For the youngest, any life that's held in suspension is a life that's being stolen and being thrown into danger, being thrown into fear. This is something that children should not have to experience, and children are the victims, the first victims of atrocities that adults are committing, and at least 158 have paid with their lives. This must stop. Almost 2 million children are already fleeing war. 60% of the population in Ukraine is internally displaced, and some people who have remained live in constant fear of the ongoing conflict. The European Union is taking its responsibility. It's acted rapidly to implement the Directive on Temporary Protection. There has to be quick and speedy support for those fleeing Ukraine without any distinction. We have to make sure the most vulnerable are protected so that we don't add to the horrors of war, discrimination, and affecting their dignity in that way. We have to make sure that their official transports after they've crossed borders to make sure we avoid exploitation and abuse and trafficking of children. We need to provide the support they need, the needs they need. We have to find a tutor that's appointed immediately for these unaccompanied children and try and achieve family reunification. We have to allow these children and teenagers to have prospects of a future of a dignified fashion. We have to reopen the possibility to have access to a child guarantee and to education. If they have access to education, culture, psychosocial support, and sexual and reproductive health and rights, that is extremely important. There are associations, civil society organisations, local authorities as well, who have acted in exemplary fashion. You are the face of Europe welcoming people, and let us make us proud of the solidarity we've shown that your actions and voices have called for so many years. It is now time to put human and financial resources at the direct disposal of the organisations, local authorities and citizens who are showing solidarity, who shouldn't have to shoulder this entire burden themselves. Yes, there are things being put in place to help people fleeing Ukraine, but this shows that European solidarity works. What we're implementing today has to provide a pillar, a common pillar, that common asylum and migration policy in Europe is built on welcoming, on solidarity, on being humane. And this appeal is one of the vast majority of this chamber, following close cooperation between the different political groups. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to the Ukrainian youth and the youth of Europe as well.
Danke, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Simona Baldassare.
Grazie Presidente. Colleghi, ogni minuto in Ucraina un...
Thank you very much. Colleagues, every minute a child becomes a refugee in Ukraine. That's what UNICEF said a few days ago. Many children have completely lost the basis of their life. They've grown up very fast. Either they become refugees or they're shut up in various cellars or shelters. About 2 million children have left Ukraine in the hope of finding a better future. We in the European Union need to take action. Many of these children risk being exposed to trafficking in human beings. When they enter the European Union, we must immediately register and identify these children. And if we've got children that are accompanied, we must see who they're traveling with. We have to see what their needs are, and if they need health services or if they need psychological help, they should get it. There are also orphans who are in the middle of this war. There are babies who've been born in bunkers and shelters during the war. It's a tragedy. We've got to help these children. We've got to set up humanitarian corridors so that they can reach the EU safely. Those are some of the main points in our report. It would be positive to include all political groups in this work. These are children who should not be exposed to ideological wars. Let's stand shoulder to shoulder and ensure that these children have a future. If we're to get peace on earth, if we want to combat war, we've got to start with the children. Thank you.
Zu Wort gemeldet hat sich Frau.
The next speaker is Ms. Jadwiga Wiśniewska.
Panie komisarz, szanowni państwo.
Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, mothers are being raped and children abused, mothers fleeing from Ukraine to the closest safe haven. This safe haven turned out to be Poland. In the last weeks, over 2.5 million Ukrainians fled to Poland. It is Polish people that received Ukrainians. Some 160,000 children are now have access to Polish educational system. We have provided all rights, healthcare, and otherwise. We appeal to create a fund to finance all the costs. We have received over 2.5 million refugees. What funds have we received? You are so emotional and saying that it's so horrible. We must begin to act. And we should stop with appearances. We need decisive sanctions. We're talking about genocide and the violation of basic human rights. And what is the Union doing? Sanctioning Poland, who received 2.5 million refugees. The funds that we should receive are being blocked. But of course, remember the annexation of the Crimea and the embargo on exports of arms to Russia. How many European member states violated those sanctions, this embargo? 10. And the current sanctions are equally ineffective. So the women first violated are later run over by tanks. And it is not only a war against Ukraine, it is a war against the West, a war against the world as a whole. If we are talking about human rights, they are being violated because the sanctions are not real.
Cornelia Ernst zum
Ms. Cornelia Ernst is the next speaker.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren.
Ladies and gentlemen, maybe this could be a good day if we have a resolution on the table that doesn't just talk about promising humanitarian aid in its headline, but in its context as well, because in war, young people and children often without any protection, all of them. And that's why it's right that we talk about Roma children, stateless children, young students, but also especially vulnerable people like LGBTI people should be included and protected from violence, because Bucha has shown us clearly that people who go around killing others don't ask for their ID cards first. So support our amendments so children and young people who are in prison and detention centres in Ukraine, most of these being third country nationals, should not be forgotten. Children are children regardless of where they come from. And that's why I call on you to stop speaking with a forked tongue here. Because protecting people in Ukraine should be a priority. Protecting children, that is absolutely clear, and I stand behind that. But to condemn people to rotting in prison because they come from another country is not acceptable. We don't want ideologies and racism now. We want selfless help to show what a society really can achieve. And in these sort of times, equality and freedom are values that nobody should ignore. And hence the support of all fleeing children is necessary. All of those who are on the external borders of the EU especially. Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you. I'll ask now Ms. Daniela Rondinelli to come to the lectern.
Grazie Presidente, gentile Commissario. Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. Since the beginning of the war, 4 million refugees from Ukraine have streamed into the EU, and that includes 1 million minors who we're talking about today. We're talking about their entry into Europe and all the actions that we're establishing in order to welcome them and in order to safeguard their rights. As we've said, their rights are fundamental. I would like to put the focus on a problem which is dear to my heart. It's the fact that all of these young people, all of these students are breaking off their studies. They're no longer able to train. If we want to truly protect these young people who are fleeing from war, then we need to go above and beyond simply welcoming them and hosting them. We need to work on integration. We need to have humanitarian teaching corridors and other mechanisms of solidarity so that young people, teachers and students from Ukraine can enter our schools. We must do everything in our power to ensure that dialogue happens and to do more, working together hand in hand with Ukrainian students in Ukrainian universities. There needs to be a right to continued schooling and university for Ukrainians and for others who want to arrive in Europe. We could have an extraordinary program, Erasmus for Ukraine. Erasmus Ukraine would allow students to sign up for free this year, and it would establish a waiver for learning for those teachers who are currently in the war. Diplomas would be recognized as, and this would be extremely important for young Ukrainian people so that they can reconstruct and help the renaissance of their country. What's always been so good about our policies is that we have been able to bring people together and to build wealth and prosperity together. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sabine Verheyen now can take the floor.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioners. The European Union is based on the belief that war on the continent of Europe has been consigned to history. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin has destroyed this. The attack of Putin on Ukraine involves attacks on civilians, women and children. These attacks are happening on schools, theatres and hospitals, and this is an attack on our very values in Europe and is a crime against humanity. The Russian invasion in Ukraine is not just threatening the population, but threatening the future of a whole generation. Many people fleeing are children and in need of a special protection. We have to make sure these people get protection and access to education so they have a future, regardless of where they have to flee to. Otherwise, in the longer term, we risk a lost generation. Children need special protection from any form of violence or abuse, and we have to take care of children. Schools are extremely important for the physical and mental and psychological health of those children who've had to leave their home country. Psychosocial support and a safe environment is what children who've been traumatized need, and it is our obligation to do our utmost to make sure that we provide help for these children and enable a future to be one of their prospects that they can see. So we need to make sure they have access to education at all levels, psychosocial support for traumatized children, support for unaccompanied children and young people, including stateless people. And that means the EU needs to make sure that the member states support us in getting access to Erasmus and other programs. This shouldn't just be something that we think of as part-time. It's an obligation as human beings.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, Ms. Gabriela Bischoff has the floor.
Danke, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, this war is having an effect on an entire generation of children in Ukraine, but also on a whole generation of children and young people in Europe who see how we are dealing with this war and with refugee children and young people. And therefore it's important. The 7.5 million children and young people in Ukraine need help. They need psychosocial support. And that's why it's important that we're having this discussion. And I think it's absolutely horrific that the Council is not here. Obviously, the debate is not of sufficient interest to them. As S&D, we have already called on the Council to adopt a child protection package, and it's important that we do that again. Who protects these children if we don't do it? As Ms. Johansson said, we must first and foremost treat these child refugees as children. It sounds easy, but it isn't, and that's why we need special measures, and that's why education is so important. We have to make sure that we have inclusive access, that we give digital support to these children. We have to make sure that there's childcare available so that the women can enter the labor market. Exploitation of these children and women is a huge risk. We see that the international networks of traffickers of human beings are on the spot. We can be proud in Europe that we have the child guarantee, but we must give it a fresh coat of paint. We have to adapt it to this situation, and that means financing. Because one thing is clear, I've said that from the beginning, at the end of the day, we will be measured according to whether or not we could protect these children in the war, and we as in the European Parliament will do our utmost to make sure that they find safety.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Petros Austrevicius.
Mr. Chair, dear Commissioners, colleagues, the war of aggression launched by the Putin regime against Ukraine is primarily directed towards Ukrainian civilians, especially women and children. The brutal and criminal acts of Putin's war amount to ethnic cleansing and genocide. Putin is seeking to expel Ukrainians from their homeland, to seize their land and property. Atrocious war crimes committed by Russian soldiers increasingly threaten the security and livelihoods of Ukrainian people. The Russian aggressors seek to impede the evacuation of civilians, oftentimes by taking advantage of humanitarian corridors in order to force the resettlements of Ukrainians to Russia. The UN Refugee Agency must facilitate the safe return of all Ukrainian refugees. I sincerely do not understand this strongly question the agreements made by the head of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, during his visit to Moscow to open refugee camps in Russia. Can we allow this de facto human trafficking? Ukrainian refugees, especially children and young adults, should not become a lost generation, deprived of a happy childhood and the chance of an education. We must do everything we can to ensure the future of peaceful Ukrainian caught up in the Putin's war. It is also important that Ukrainian children receive an education without losing their cultural identity and language. Ukrainians are in need of safe refuge. We must now behave as Europeans and welcome all of them into our family, into our union. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Ali.
Thank you. The next speaker is Alice Kuhnke for 2.5 minutes.
Herr talman.
President, Commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. I've just got back from Ukraine and Poland. Together with Polish volunteers, I visited an area northwest of Lviv, in Yavoriv, a small town. Ukraine's future is fleeing. In the villages around, the population have doubled, tripled, even in terms of the number of people. Many children who have been fleeing are fleeing within their own country. Putin's bombs have forced millions of children to flee and to leave their homes behind them. Those who should be sitting safely in their school benches or playing in their kindergartens instead are left in uncertainty. Teenage rooms have been exchanged for camp beds in transit camps. Playgrounds have been exchanged for metro stations to work as bunkers. These people fleeing have their first experience of the EU of the people they meet at the border. And there's a lot of people received with warmth, with blankets, a bit of chocolate, but the Polish authorities nor EU resources were often not to be found. And whoever could have not had any difficulty in finding these people who were tired and exploited them. At another border station, there were children who had frozen to death, who had died of lack of water in their parents', in mostly mothers' arms. There are trafficking leagues that are there to pick up women before they've even left Ukraine and pick them up once they cross the border. I saw testimonies where women were obliged to pay their access with sex. Nobody should be exposed to that. No child should have to experience that. The EU has to eradicate men buying sex, men buying women and children. How ridiculous is that? How sick is that? Who is kidnapping children? Who has sex with children? Who buys women who are fleeing, who've lost everything? It's those men who have a special place in hell. The EU has resources, they have responsibility. After these days, however, in Poland and Ukraine, I'm worried that our big words about how horrible this is will not be followed by actions, by deeds. It is a nightmare what we saw, but that we didn't do everything we could would be awful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Jean-Paul Garot has the floor.
The conflict in Ukraine is upending the whole world. The scenes of devastation are increasing in number. There are more and more victims. The people are affected very hard, particularly women and children who are fleeing. They leave their houses behind. They separate themselves from their husbands who have been left to defend the country. It is unacceptable that such a tragedy is unfolding on the European continent. Given these scenes, there has been solidarity, great humanity. People have spurred themselves into action. We must further encourage all initiatives at all levels which provide support to these unfortunate people. The remarkable countries on the list includes Poland. 2.5 million refugees have been taken in. Romania, Hungary, and there are others too. It's the best of a Europe of nations. We must support all of those countries, but they're not being supported. It's quite the opposite. It's stunning to see that while there is solidarity, no European aid has reached these countries I've mentioned. But what's even worse is that the European Court of Justice and the European Commission have taken sanctions against Hungary and Poland. They are criticised of breaking the rule of law, but I think that is a questionable allegation. These are different issues, but it's shocking. We see that there is solidarity, but the Commission doesn't support Poland and Hungary. The Commission has stopped 39.4 million euros from reaching Poland and 7 million euros from reaching Hungary. These countries are exemplary in their solidarity, showing solidarity to millions of refugees, but they are being punished by our institutions. These countries must not be sanctioned. No, they must be helped and congratulated. The Commission found the funds to deal with the health crisis, to sanction Russia and to find money for weapons for Ukraine. The Commission should also provide support for Poland and Hungary. It should start by lifting sanctions and allowing them to have access to European funds. Maybe the Commission doesn't like the political systems in those countries, but I am very scandalized by the fact that the left and the liberals in this country are putting pressure on the Commission so that the Commission wouldn't make 39.4 billion euros available to Poland. The Socialists and the Democrats, the Greens, the left and the S&D on the 24th of March spoke to the Commission about that, and I think that is wrong. The European Commission must unblock the recovery funds and provide additional support so that these millions of refugees, these vulnerable people, can be protected. They are vulnerable to many threats. Thank you.
See, our next speaker.
Thank you.
Robert Zīle.
Honourable Chair, Commissioners, the best way to protect children and youth from Ukraine would be to adopt very strong sanctions this week relating to energy so that we do not keep feeding the war machinery of Russia. Of course, we will hope for such sanctions, but there are very many young people who already are here in the European Union, in some states more and some less, and many of them are under the risk of criminal activities, of criminal bans. So we need integration. That, of course, is a very delicate thing about integrating the youth and children in the countries where they end up. That is because it is very important also to keep up the Ukrainian space of culture and education for these youngsters. And it is very important. There are countries like Latvia, for example, where there is still Russian education available in state countries. And if we will send the Ukrainian kids to these schools, it would end up not with good results, because there, of course, the narrative also arrives not only from the state means, but also from the Russian propaganda, and that would be very dangerous for this Ukrainian generation. So therefore, they would have to have this link kept with their own identity, with the Ukrainian language. That means we have to support the local municipalities so that they could improve the situation and create such Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian language space. And we could also use editions from all kinds of companies like ANOK. They have study books, and I would believe that most of these children and youth will return to Ukraine, provided they have a respective education here. Thank you.
Thank you. Frau Marlene Björk, Sie sind unsere nächste Rednerin.
Malin Björk is our next speaker.
Snart har 4 miljoner.
Thank you. 4 million people almost have fled from Putin's horrible war. Most are children and women, and they're particularly exposed, as we know from all refugee situations. And the best time that we can support them is as they cross the border. So we've got to focus there so that they're not caught up with traffickers and other people who want to exploit the situation of women and children. We know that voluntary organizations are doing a lot of work on the ground, so there must be support for them and for the local authorities. Children should be able to go to school. They should have the freedom to move and do sport, and it's important for us to ensure that that happens. And I want to say something about the fact that women and young girls are exploited sexually. We see that in all refugee situations, and we need to deal with that at the border, but we also need to make sure that we don't have a sex industry in Europe. We have these sex industries which exploit vulnerable women and girls without any control. We've got to do our utmost to stop this. We've got a terrible situation. We've got millions of children fleeing, and this shows the racism of the EU's refugee policy. A lot of us are very happy to see that we're now wanting to care for these refugees, but we should do the same for all other children who are refugees. We shouldn't lock them up in refugee camps in Greece or anywhere else. Children should be able to go to school and should be able to be free, and that applies to all children. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Andrea Bokshoff has asked for the floor.
Köszönöm, elnök úr. A gyermekek...
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Children are our future. That's why we have to be extremely careful that in these difficult times we can provide safety for children. More than 4.8 million people to date have fled. About half of them are children and young people who require an extra degree of care. They need to be able to find safe refuge in EU member states, and it's extremely important when it becomes possible that they can return, but until then they should be allowed to attend school. Hungary to date has taken in 400,000 refugees, and we're doing everything we can to ensure these people are safe and ensure they have access to health and psychosociological support, and of course that they get lessons in school. We have also introduced Hungarian conversation classes in afternoons in universities. We have to pay attention to those children who come unaccompanied. In Ukraine, there are also many displaced persons. We have to make sure that our help reaches them too. I can imagine that the EU should set up a program whereby these children, these families, be fed and provided for in Ukraine. In the Transcarpathian region, there are more than 300,000 refugees who've arrived. About 400 children are orphans, and they are particularly vulnerable. So we have to do our utmost to help these children.
Thank you
very much. Sean Dinas has asked for the floor.
Dank u, voorzitter. Miljoenen mensen zijn...
Thank you, Chairman. Millions of people have left Ukraine. They've fled the war crimes of Putin and the bombs, and we've seen in Bucha what these people were exposed to before they fled, and what has happened to the people who stayed behind. 90% of refugees are women and children, children who should be able to be children, who should be able to go to school, to play freely. And we've said this before. It's lovely to see how all of Europe is standing together, and how volunteers are helping, how we see prams made available at stations for fleeing mothers, how children share their toys. I'm very proud of this solidarity which is being seen in Europe at the moment. But we need action to maintain this wave of solidarity, because there's a big challenge, and it continue to be a big challenge. We need to stand together to help refugees. We have to make sure that the budget is there so that children have access to health care, education and psychosocial support. We need to protect children against trafficking by these criminal gangs who are always lurking to take advantage of vulnerable people. We need to focus on the most vulnerable refugees, and we need to have proper registration of refugees so nobody is lost. While we're bringing our children to school well wrapped up against the cold, Ukrainian mothers are writing essential information on the backs of their children, hoping that somebody will look after them. We've got to do our utmost to make sure that those children as well can just be children. Thank you very much. Ms. Helene Fritzon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Commissioners. When in Mariupol the theatre was bombed, there was a little girl who was hidden under the concrete and the dust. Miraculously, she survived, but she hasn't spoken a word since then. The war in Ukraine is a brutal war against our children. In the middle of March, we Social Democrats therefore issued important demands to protect children who are affected by war. And so I and we are very pleased that we're looking at a resolution concerning children now. No child ever should have to experience a war anywhere, ever. All children have a right to a safe childhood. And when it comes to the response of the EU to the war in Ukraine, we Social Democrats demand that the Convention on the Rights of the Child that all EU member states have signed be respected and implemented. The best for children, as we have said on many an occasion, has to be respected in any decision concerning children. Hence, I welcome Commissioner Ylva Johansson's very clear statement that we are to ensure that children be registered in a correct fashion at the borders. We should see all children. We have to bolster our work in the EU to prevent the risks of abuse. The needs for children, the simple needs of clean water, food, psychosocial support, and safe places to both rest and to play, plus education, must be prioritised. Children don't just have a right to survive, they also have a right to safety, development, education, and play. All children have the same rights and the same values. We are to do our utmost to ensure the human rights of these children and that we actually live up to our responsibilities. Thank you.
Madame Loiseau, Nathalie.
Nathalie Loiseau.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Some have died under the bombs and will never become adults. Some were born inside and have not yet seen the light of day. Some were in school and their schools were bombed. They've been separated from their parents. They've been forced to go to Russia. There are those who have fled. They are the children of Ukraine. Europe has opened its arms to them. But every day we must ask ourselves, are we doing enough for the children of Ukraine? Let me say something. We must do much, much more. More for those who are still in Ukraine and who don't have enough supplies. We need more humanitarian aid because dogs are being eaten in Mariupol. We must exert greater pressure on Moscow so that there can be more evacuations of women and children. We must support Moldova, which has a record number of inhabitants, 100,000 in that country, which just has 2.5 million people. Half of those who have been hosted are children. I want to know what is going to happen next. How are we going to ensure that all refugees receive support? Moldovan families have opened their houses and are sharing everything they have. I want to ask donors, how will you support Chisinau, which is doing its best? I asked member states to ensure that the poorest country in Europe not be left to shoulder this burden alone. One final word about the children of Ukraine and their mothers. Some of these children were born from surrogacy or from IVF. And some have been asking, how is this even possible in Ukraine that there be surrogacy allowed? Well, if you're in favour of life, then you're in favour of all lives. I hope that these mothers and these children will be welcomed in Europe as they ought to be, welcomed warmly and with humanity. Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you very much. Ms. Diana Rybakina, you have the floor.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. The war in Ukraine has already led to thousands of civilian deaths, including young people and children. It has forced more than 4 million people to flee and to seek out protection in Europe. Of those 4 million, 2 million are still of schooling age. According to UNICEF, 90% of refugees are boys, girls and women. Various NGOs tell us that there are many non-accompanied minors among the refugees. They are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, abuse and sexual exploitation. It is of the utmost importance that we protect all of these boys and girls, and we ensure that their rights are safeguarded, including from a gender perspective. That's why the work of UNICEF and the UNHCR is so vital. That work is being done together with governments and civil society organizations on the border, in the border areas. They are creating blue dot hubs. These are safe spaces along border crossings for girls, boys and women. The devastating consequences of this war won't be resolved in the immediate term. We need foresight. We need a broader approach to implement integration and hosting policies at national, at regional and local level. That includes access to education and to the labour market. It includes family reunification, psychosocial support and access to basic services. It's not just lives that are being lost, it's futures too. We must ensure that the conditions are in place so that in Europe all boys and girls fleeing from war can find themselves in a peaceful and safe environment, which they deserve. They should be allowed to go back to the classroom. The EU needs to be a place where they can imagine a future for themselves. Thank you very much.
Danke, Mr.
Thank you very much.
Voorzitter, collega's, het Vlaams Belang.
Thank you. Vlaams Belang has always said that the right to asylum is a basic human right on two conditions. First of all, we really got to be talking about war refugees, and they've got to be received in their own region. We can expect up to 12 million women and children fleeing Ukraine who need support. There is a big wave of solidarity across all parties, but we shouldn't be too shouldn't hide the fact that we can't deal with this if we continue the asylum policy that we have at the moment. We've had millions of young men who've come into Europe. 2/3 of them were refused because they were not really as refugees. They were looking for an economic improvement. We've got to be we have to have realism and have a proper asylum policy. So we've got to suspend the asylum policy for those people who are not of Ukrainian nationality, because we've got to keep this for the people who need it most, Ukrainian children. So we've got to deal with asylum seekers from out with Europe and send them back as soon as possible, because most of them are not really in need of asylum. We've got to make sure that we support the citizens of Ukraine with funds from the European Union. We can help a lot more people in our neighboring countries than in places which have a high population density like Flanders. Hungary and Poland are hosting 3 million. They're so often criticized, but they're doing a great job, and we need to support them. We need to shift to another asylum policy which works. We've got to host people in their own region. Africans should be in Africa, Asians in Asia, and Europeans in Europe. Thank you.
Nun hat sich Herr
Mr. Witold-Jan Waśniakowski.
Panie Przewodniczący.
President, Commissioners, we expected problems from Russia. We warned for years. We asked you to provide security for this part of Europe. Even a few days before the war, we were told that the EU would not take care of this security problem. You wanted to engage into cooperation with Russia even more. Are you going to say the same to the Mariupol children today? Poland has received over 1 million children. What do they need? They need, most of all, peace. They need more efforts from the EU or maybe the French presidency, or more gestures like President Metzola's. We need to cooperate with the Ukrainian authorities. We need to register those who have crossed the border. As a teacher, I would like to focus on the issue of education. We need European funds for the transportation and evacuation of those children. We need to provide them language learning. We need to have new books for these children which would integrate curricula that taught in Ukrainian and in Polish schools. We need teachers, we need psychologists dealing with integration and cultural integration. We need special scholarship programs, but also programs of care for the youngest so that their mothers can work. Thank you very much.
Danke, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much. Ms. Katarina Konečná has asked for the floor.
Thank you, Madam, Mr. Chairman, dear Commissioners. I will support the Protect the Children resolution because they are the weakest in the war and deserve protection. Nevertheless, this resolution, Central Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, they accept a huge number of refugees, even compared to the 2015 standards. Poland accepted about 2 million refugees, but Germany only 1.5 million back in 2015, and it's a much bigger country. Why I'm saying this? Because this is a big burden on the systems of a healthcare system, of education, and so on. We should honor these countries. People offer their homes to refugees without any funds from anybody else. And this should be mentioned in the resolution. The resolution speaks about what member states should do without mentioning what they already have done. in the Ukraine, we have a lot of people with rare diseases and about 13 as much patients with HIV. And that basically means that we have like between 13 and 16,000 new cancer patients a month. Also, the children need vaccinations, and we need hundreds of thousands of live vaccinations which need to be produced. Colleagues, you have to help us now, otherwise our healthcare systems will collapse. Please help us with beds and help us with healthcare materials. Show solidarity in your acts. Thank you very much.
Danke.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lefteris Nikolaou Alavanos, please.
Η απαράδεκτη εισβολή της Ρωσίας στην Ουκρανία και ο πόλεμος.
The Russian invasion and the war, also a result of NATO, EU, US involvement, has led to refugees, thousands, millions of refugees, many of whom are children. And this is a terrible situation. We must take all people into our countries without there being any criteria. We, as the Greek Communist Party, are supporters of refugees and we must do everything to help them. People must be welcomed with humane conditions and we need to provide education for young children. All children and refugees must be welcomed into our countries. That includes migrant children, Russian-speaking children, and others who may have worked or lived in Ukraine. We must be in line with all of the criteria in the Geneva Convention. It's so important that the EU and all EU member states and all EU member state governments look also at what's happening in Libya, Syria and other countries and treat those countries the same, because currently we have a state of hypocrisy and we shouldn't just think that Ukrainians fit in better because they look more similar to us. And in addition, we shouldn't think that just because they have a similar creed to us and then other refugees are at risk of being oppressed or turned away, or they are put in terrible camps such as on Lesbos or Moria, and there are huge mega structures for them. Now we should not forget that all of these children are the victims of terrible wars. Support needs to be provided, their rights need to be safeguarded and so on. It's also important that we withdraw ourselves from military alliances and we fight for the interest of the people against the system which brings about war and which then leads to exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Tomasz Frankowski.
Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący.
President, Commissioner, the Russian invasion not only threatens Ukraine and its people, but also threatens an entire generation. Half of the refugees are young people, so we need to give them access to education. Children fleeing Ukraine are helpless, so teachers should be well prepared to work with such traumatized children. To ensure quick access to education, we should use online platforms used in the pandemic. We must ensure that young children and adolescents from Ukraine continue their education. So school education gateway could be a good way to proceed. We must also not forget Ukrainian students that are the future of Ukraine. And I am pleased to say that many member states offered grants to those students. We should also recognize qualifications of teachers and health workers, because this will also help children in their in the states of receiving them. Sport is also important, and those children should have access to sport activities, because this can help them psychologically to overcome their traumas. This will also help them integrate. This is our common responsibility to make sure that these children feel safe and have a future.
Danke, ich bitte Frau Birgit.
Thank you. Ms. Birgit Sippel.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Refugees are people who are fleeing hunger or war. These are men, women and children. They all need security and stability. They need secure routes for fleeing, particularly children and their families. The war in Ukraine is just outside our front door, and it requires us to do our utmost to receive refugees. And we're seeing civil society, cities and local authorities throughout Europe are prepared to help. And we've got to recognize that, and the Commission must give these organizations, these cities and local authorities, access to EU funds, and rapidly. Having said that, it's not just up to civil society to receive refugees from Ukraine. This applies particularly to unaccompanied minors. We have to have clear state structures to ensure the welfare of children. The Commission and the Member States must rapidly find and ensure that there is safe transport of refugees, particularly in the context of family unification. The Solidarity platform and the index for analyzing the capacity to receive refugees are a good first step towards this. And after that, there have to be specific steps taken to distribute the refugees who need our help. After the decision of temporary protection, the Council, which unfortunately is absent today, has to take the next step to ensure that the families and children get the support and the protection they need.
Thank you, colleague. I now give the floor to Ms. Thun Hohenstein.
Good that such a vast majority present in this room agrees. I host 3 children and minors from eastern Ukraine for over a month now. They are accompanied, they go to Polish schools and kindergarten, they are in our warm and safe home, and still, the 3-year-old Arturchik tells me with wide open eyes, "Why are they shooting at my daddy? You know, bad people, evil people are shooting at my daddy. Why?" Scars will remain. And yes, we all must undertake all that is possible to make them bearable and to put an end to this horror. Commissioner Dubravka-Šuica stressed, all children have a right to a happy and normal childhood. All. So let us struggle for all of them. The prolongation of the Ukrainian-Polish border is the border between Poland and Belarus. It's the same line. It is also our Schengen border. And there, in the forests and swamps, for months already, families with children are pushed back, mistreated, freezing, starving, dying. Their only fault is that they are from Central Asia, most of them. Those volunteers who struggle to save their lives are not awarded with high distinctions, but are accused of human trafficking. The prosecution demanded their arrest. Please, let us not divide humans. Let us not divide children into categories. Please remember also those at the Belarusian border. Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Miss Katrin Langensiepen.
When the war started in Ukraine, my first thought was, what happens to the 2.7 million of persons with disabilities in that war? What does war mean from a perspective of a child with disabilities? In Ukraine live 82,000 children with disabilities. It might be more. When your parents are afraid and you cannot flee, what does it mean to you? When you are a wheelchair user, how is it possible for you to go down in a bomb cellar with your parents or not? How do you know that's an alarm when you can't hear the sirens and your parents are not there? I contacted a disability NGO in Kiev. I asked him, what do you need? Answer, everything, but the most is attention. No one cares about us, about persons and children with disabilities. There's no access to transport. There's no access to information, no access to accessible shelters. And how do we know how accessible the places where the families with disabled children need to go? Is there an accessible shelter in Poland? Is there an interpreter for deaf people, for me as a deaf person? I don't know, so I stay in Kiev, nevertheless, if the bombs are there or not. When we want to support NGOs, structures, and support children with disabilities, we must be sure that the money goes into an accessible direction, must be used for accessibility. We have to offer accessible healthcare, accessible shelters, accessible education, personal assistance, interpreters inside the European Union in our member states. I call the Commission, you and member states, to take the UNCRPD Article 7 into account, where it's written, in all actions concerning children with disabilities, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Kollegin. Am Wort.
Thank you, colleague. The next speaker is Mr. Guido Reil.
Herr Präsident, liebe
President, ladies and gentlemen, I have traveled to Ukraine with humanitarian aid and I saw a country in the grip of fear. I saw men who were prepared to do anything to defend their country. I've seen women and children fleeing. And obviously they're exposed to danger and need protection. We have the traffickers in human beings ready to take people into prostitution or in dealing in organs, but we also need protection, protect them against young men from Asia and Africa who have mixed in with this exodus and are exposing, using this crisis. There were women who were raped by a Tunisian and an Afghan in Germany, and they had to flee back to Poland because they didn't feel safe in Germany. I have a refugee starting with a young woman with a baby, and she's only been a month in Germany, and she's already working in hotel and catering. We have to decide whether we want to help real refugees or just economic migrants who've come in with no papers. They've left children and families behind in their country of origin. And then they abuse our hospitality. I want to make I want to make space for real refugees. I want to release funds for real refugees, for women and children. Thank you.
Ich erteile Herrn Richard.
I now give the floor to Mr. Richard Czarnecki.
Panie Przewodniczący,
President, commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, do not ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for you. This is our tragedy because Ukraine is a part of Europe, so this is a tragedy of Europe. And it's not an exotic matter. It is also our responsibility. We cannot just watch it without doing anything. We should pass from words to deeds, because of course it's easy to talk about solidarity, about support, and much more difficult to do concrete things, to provide concrete help to these people, both to the internally displaced people in Ukraine, around 7 million people, and to this huge wave of refugees, over 2 million people. 70% of those have come to my country, to Poland, 2.5 million. Of course, it's easy to say on behalf of the European Parliament, we are providing help, we are helping, but these beautiful words should be followed by financial decisions. For the moment, this is much more difficult. For the moment, the aid to the countries receiving refugees is only symbolic. And I do agree with Ms. Zippel, who said that it's not only a matter for the civil society. Yes, of course, civil society plays an important part. And so the financial support should also reach those member states. And then the matter of the hybrid war on the Belarusian border. Let's watch this situation and let's help the refugees. Thank you very much.
Das Wort hat unsere Kollegin.
I now give the floor to Ms. Šojdrová.
Vážená paní komisař.
Madam Commissioner, colleagues, already more than a month the war in Ukraine has been going on. The Russian aggression in the Ukraine is destroying human lives, destroying their property, chasing many of them from their homes. Of course, those who suffer the most are the children. There are 3.7 million refugees out of the Ukraine. On the move now, 90% of those are women and children. I would like to thank all member states helping these people to reach safety, to find provisional shelters. Of course, the children are the most vulnerable here, and that is why the European Parliament wants to adopt this resolution. What is most important is the creation of humanitarian corridors for granting safe passage to people who are fleeing the war. I'm very sorry that I'm not seeing any representative of the French presidency here today. We should be hearing, we should be told what the French president has done with his mandate in order to help precisely these children, these people who need to get out of besieged cities such as Mariupol and others. I'm sure you've also seen the sad eyes of Ukrainian children becoming happier all of a sudden when they reach a group of their peers, when they can kick a ball around, when they can ride a bike again. Children are the future of Ukraine. Children are the future of the EU. And all that we do here and now for Ukrainian children, we are also doing for ourselves, for Europe. Children with their mothers need to find accommodation, healthcare, psychological help, and of course education. In this regard, I would like to commend the work done by member states and the Commission. We have the solidarity platform, we have the registration platform, we are making sure that children don't get lost, we are making sure that we have educational platforms to help exchange good practice information between member states. I would like to thank once more the member states helping. I would like to thank all volunteers. Let's make sure that not a single child gets lost, that not a single child is without aid. I would also like to remind everybody that the Czech Republic is hosting 300,000 refugees and is also helping. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Jongerius.
Thank you, President, Commissioners. In recent days, we've seen horrific images from Ukraine meeting our eyes, and we saw wasted towns, cities, villages razed to the ground, children and women on the streets. Almost 4 million Ukrainian refugees have left Ukraine, and half of them are children. We can't leave them in the lurch. They need more than just nice words, than just lip service. They need even more than just a nice resolution from the European Parliament. They need our support, our action, because outside the theatre of war there are still huge risks. Poverty, exclusion, and exploitation are lying in wait within the European Union as well, and so a speedy, targeted form of action is necessary. The European social pillar is very clear. Social inclusion and protection are crucial, and the urgency of the Porto goals is just becoming more and more evident. In Porto, we said we're going to fight poverty, we're going to make inclusion possible. It must be time to deliver now. Europe has to speak with one voice and say that we have not forgotten the Ukrainian children. They have to have appropriate education, accommodation, good care. They have to have appropriate help and care for social and psychological support. We have to show that we're willing to invest in the future of the Ukrainian children and that we can provide structural help as well, because Europe being a safe refuge doesn't mean that we just pay lip service to it. We have to act as well.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Dragos Pizlaru.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Vice President Šuica, dear Commissioner Johansson, honourable colleagues, this weekend the world saw the atrocities committed by Vladimir Putin's armies against civilians in Bucha. These crimes are yet another reminder of Russia's willingness to attack innocent people and act against the international law. And it is our duty to step up our actions to help Ukraine and its civilians seeking security within our Union. Our duty is only increased by the fact that the majority of Ukrainian refugees entering Europe are vulnerable children and young people. I've seen them with my own eyes at the border between Romania and Ukraine. I've seen them together with Commissioner Nicola Schmid when visiting a transit facility in Ploiești, women and children with their eyes in tears. As we welcome the first necessary tools introduced by the Commission, the Temporary Protection Directive and the Care Plus packages, we should use the resilience of our social security systems to receive these children in the best conditions. Protecting children fleeing from war is a right we must fulfill in their best interest, away from any discrimination. We must protect them from the other dangers present on the way to Europe: violence, exploitation, abuse, trafficking and abduction, dangers we will not want our children to encounter. And this is not only about the refugees, the children coming from Ukraine, it's also about protecting vulnerable people in general. This is about the social resilience of the European Union. This is about the child guarantee, about the European pillar of social rights, about not leaving people behind. This is the reality that we need to be there for vulnerable people, generally speaking. And together with the member states, civil societies and volunteers, we should not give up on Ukraine. Let's continue working together towards a safer Europe where innocent, disadvantaged children and citizens are protected, where the images seen this weekend should not be seen again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pizarro.
Fitzgerald.
President, Commissioners, colleagues, we are in a serious, unprecedented child protection crisis, and it's of an enormous scale. The brutality inflicted on Ukraine in places like Bucha, Mariupol, Odessa and Kharkiv are war crimes. Murder, torture, rape, death, adults brutalized and traumatized. Imagine what it is like as a child. Just imagine. This is the devastation of Ukraine for all of us to see. Children separated from their families, as families are torn apart, their security gone. Strange places, strange journeys, new countries, new languages. This is the traumatization of a generation, the shattering of the security of childhood. Colleagues, every sanction must be used by us and our partners around the world. And as they perpetrate such crimes against every generation, Russia must cease to be a member of the UN Human Rights Council. This is life and death, with access to food, safety, education and psychosocial support, all immediate needs for children. The fate of a generation is at stake and we must help them, and we are helping. Firstly, we also have to be vigilant for traffickers. In every dire situation, there is someone who seeks to profit. Our police must be at the top of their game. The coordination must be excellent. Secondly, we must ensure the children's right to education is not interrupted. These months, while these children are displaced and in other countries, must not be the ones where they just survive, but where they thrive. Thirdly, warm beds and safe houses are what make children feel secure. Many are traumatized already. Parents, particularly mothers, need care, need support so that they can get back on their feet. We must also embrace unaccompanied minors. Being alone in the world at such a young age, can you imagine it? One of the most terrifying things you can possibly imagine. Our actions today can empower those who will build Ukraine again. It is our duty to help them now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Massimiliano Smerillo, the floor is yours.
Grazie Presidente, sono quasi 3 milioni.
Thank you, President. Almost 3 million young people are in dire need. Only 47,000 have actually had access to educational material or to recreational material. Not enough. There are students who are particularly affected by this war. Now it's up to the member states to deal with this challenge. They need to bring young people into their education and training systems by providing specialized training to those who have specific or special needs. We have to ensure that this war doesn't have long-lasting effects, such as school dropout or school segregation, which would lead to social exclusion or discrimination. The fact that there are no member state representatives here today is highly regrettable. We must use the tools afforded to us by digital means, so that all pupils and students can continue their education. But that needs to be an addition to in-person teaching. All of this is happening at a time when children need additional psychosocial support. That will be a way to give them a normal life with school, sport, affection, and a social life. Member states must recognize existing diplomas and training periods, not just for students, but for educators. What else can we do? It must be possible for students to end their training and education here because they're in an urgent situation. Let me remind you that We are dealing with an urgent situation and we need coordination. But above and beyond that, we must learn lessons from this terrible crisis so as to ensure that there is immediate support for refugee children, regardless of their origin, regardless of the war they're fleeing from. We must change approach with an open system that will welcome those who are fleeing war and violence. That includes children, of course, and anyone who violates the rule of law is an enemy of the European Union.
Nun.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to our Vice President, Dita Sharanzova.
A crying and exhausted little boy is walking by himself with just one plastic bag in his hands towards the border with Poland. Tired mothers carrying their children in one arm and just a couple of belongings in the other, only what they had time to pack, crossing the border with Slovakia. There are already 4 million of them. 4 million Ukrainians who have crossed the borders because their country is being brutally attacked by Russia. Russian soldiers kill innocent people in the streets, rape girls and women and torture children. But unfortunately, danger still awaits across the border, especially for women and children. They arrive to camps cramped with thousands of people. Suddenly, a car or bus appears, and somebody offers to take them to a safer place, or so they say. We have a lot of disturbing information that women have been taken away, drugged, and forced into prostitution, and that there are Ukrainian children being trafficked and exploited. We need to do everything we can to protect them. Effective registration, border management are vital to secure the safety of young and vulnerable Ukrainians. All this could be facilitated by having Frontex on the ground to help local officials deal with the immigration wave and provide safe transport of refugees further to other European countries. The European Union can and should do more to provide help in this area, to give support to the countries dealing with huge numbers of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Das Wort steht nun.
I now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Kasperi.
Geschätzte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich weiß nicht, wie es Ihnen geht, aber als Vater von 5 Kindern habe ich...
I don't know how you cope who have children, but I have tears welling in my eyes when I've seen these recent pictures. And Mr. Putin is responsible as the person who's directly ordered these bombardments. We see also pictures of fallen soldiers, of mourning parents, of destroyed planes and tanks, but also destroyed houses, hospitals, cultural installations, memorials. These are pictures that many people have already noted. Innocent people have found their lives destroyed and everything they have taken away from them. I'm at a loss for the words. I can hardly express my feelings here. And seeing the pictures that we're forced to see from Bucha, I think we all fear the situation, but we are at a loss because this is actually happening. And as a father of children, I know that it is our responsibility, despite this sorrow, that we should act and assume more responsibility than we have to date. We have to provide genuine help for the Ukrainians to help them defend themselves against this aggression. We shouldn't just apply sanctions, but in our member states, in the cities, towns and municipalities, these should be implemented. For example, if I look at the Welt am Sonntag, the German newspaper, there are many local authorities who still haven't applied these sanctions properly, and words fail me. So there are a lot of people who've fled Ukraine. Many people have mentioned that, but let's think beyond the day of today. My grandmother was expelled from the Sudetenland. She always spoke of her homeland, and that's why it's important that we help Ukrainians to win this war, and that together we then assume our responsibility to help rebuild Ukraine, to help Ukrainians rebuild Ukraine, and so that most of these people, as many as possible, can return to their country and rebuild what was once there. Thank you.
Danke, ich darf Herrn Lopez.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. Lopez Aguilar.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident Karas. Kommissaria Johansson.
Thank you, Commissioner. Since the 24th of February, the world and the EU, of course, have been shocked by the aggression of Putin against Ukraine and its people. It's been a Zeitwende, a paradigm shift. 4 million people entering European territory, and the overwhelming majority are, as we know, women and children who are extremely vulnerable. It's therefore so important that adopt this resolution, which provides support, but which also demands that the French presidency and Commission provide a coordinated response. It should start with the registration and identification of all people. It also looks at whether children have disappeared. Where might they have disappeared to? It also looks at NGOs which have become a bit overconfident, and it would provide actual secure passage for people so that they can reach places where they can be warmly welcomed. And this resolution would provide adequate funding, so it wouldn't just use AMIF, it would also use the European Social Fund, EU REACT, and all available instruments would be used so as to provide financial support to the member states as they receive so many vulnerable women and children. And these people are going to be with us. They're not going to disappear overnight. And there's also the issue of the change to the Temporary Protection Directive. We also need to provide information to these women and children so that they are protected from trafficking networks. That's why it's so important that we protect children and we protect people against prostitution, and it's so important that the Commission clamps down on all sorts of trafficking and prostitution.
The blue card from Frau Kamper. Yes, please, Madame Kamper. Do you have a blue card? Please, the floor is yours.
He needs interpretation.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący. Ja chciałam
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Mr. Lopez Aguilar.
It's okay. Thank you very much. Ja chciałam zapytać
I'd like to ask one question to Mr. Aguilar. Given what he said, I'd like to say that children are being registered in Poland. They have access to education. They are already attending schools. Some 1,200 children are in Polish hospitals. All this is taking place, but this is at the charge of Polish government. Is it true that you wrote a letter to block funds for Poland? Will you withdraw this letter? Because we all need funds to support refugees.
Mr. Lopez.
Gracias, señora Kampa.
Thank you, Ms. Kamper. The effort
of the frontline countries such as Poland, Hungary, Slovakia and Romania is being recognized throughout the Union. However, they are not the final destination countries. These people are moving to Estonia, Czech Republic, Austria. So this is a new period and there will need to be enough funding. You are talking about a letter which was not a personal letter. It was a letter that I wrote as the head of the Libe committee. This was asked of me by the spokespersons, by the coordinators of Libe. Yes, the frontline countries deserve support. However, you must still comply with the rulings of the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, particularly as regards Hungary and Poland. Thank you.
Now we'll continue on our list of speakers. Mr. Laurent Binzer now.
Thank you for the floor, Chair. Doamna comisar, stimați colegi,
Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues, in Romania we have over 650,000 refugees and over 80,000 have stayed. 43% are minors and 24,000 are of school age and some are unaccompanied. But apart from these numbers, we're talking about broken families by this horrendous war, bloody war. It's hard to imagine the tragedy that these families are going through, these families that leave behind their lives and their father they might never see again. Making sure that these children and young people are integrated in education and medical care should be a priority for the EU and for the member states. The Romanian government and local governments and civil society is doing its utmost for Ukrainian children who want to keep studying online or who want to go to Romanian schools. And because on the border with Ukraine we have Ukraine minority, Ukraine community that already has schooling in Ukrainian. We've managed to help a lot of refugee children to go to school. You see how important education is in minority languages. And just like the resolution is calling for national authorities need to be supported in order to overcome linguistic barriers for these children. We need interpretation, foreign language courses and special programs in order to recruit Ukrainian-speaking teachers and teachers who speak other minority languages in Ukraine. This is what I told President Metsola when I visited the border with Ukraine, and we should not forget that these children are Ukrainia's future, and we hope that they'll be able to live in a country that is reborn from its ashes, the ashes of the bombing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Leszek Miller, but I don't see him at the moment. He's not present. So the next speaker will be Madame Renate Bon. 2 minutes. You have the floor.
Kollegen, Herr Präsident.
Ladies and gentlemen, President, Commissioner Johansson, the horrific scenes are things that we'll not forget. The 10 million people who are displaced within Ukraine, people who've been forced to leave the country, especially women and children. I went to visit the border of Romania. Things are calming down. It's the steady flow of incoming people, but it's not on the up. We see that most people are managing to find private families to get support, families, relations. I did see a snapshot of this, but the personal impression of the contribution that individuals are making and the cooperation with organisations, be it Europol, Frontex, or with the anti-trafficking coordinator, they're doing everything. They're trying to be everywhere at all times to help the member states. One sentence, we hope for the best, but we're prepared for the worst. That remains with me. So, Commission, Council, ladies and gentlemen, we have promised our support. We've promised protection to the children and women who come to us. And we see what the services are doing, Madam Commissioner. We see the staff who are working around the clock, the member states and the agencies. Nevertheless, we still need to continue working on this because our promise for protection should not be broken. We need to know where the people are, where the children are, how they need to be provided for, where the women and children are as well. And we have to do our utmost and do everything in our powers to make sure that people don't disappear, that women don't end up in disappearing, then resurfacing in prostitution or being exploited. We need a solidarity platform. We need to work against those trying to exploit this situation and more cooperation with the agencies. But the most important aspect and almost very simple is registration, registration, registration.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mr. Antonio Lopez Isturiz White. 2 minutes. So you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Dear Commissioner, my colleagues and I in the Intergroup for Children, Defense of the Children's Rights, we have been many years denouncing what is going on with the children escaping for wars in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now is the question of Ukraine. And I have to tell you, los niños y los jóvenes.
Children and young people always pay the highest bill in wars. Even if they survive, they have traumatic scars which upend their lives forever. Others fall into the hands of people who will exploit them, monsters who kidnap children to exploit them sexually, as slaves, or for organ trafficking. There is a generation of children at risk right now. We must have a robust and coordinated system at the borders with officers who will protect children. We must help neighbouring countries so that children are registered in schools. They mustn't be robbed of their schooling years, which is so important. We must rescue vulnerable Ukrainian children, particularly those who are in hospitals, institutions, especially if these children are children with disabilities. We mustn't forget about unaccompanied minors or war orphans, and there are thousands and thousands of those who are at the borders right now. Colleagues, in the light of the barbarity in Bucha, in the light of what's happening, we must defend our European values. One thing must be crystal clear. The children of Ukraine are our children. Their future is our future. It is now the moment to act. Thank you.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. And the next is the Catch the Eye procedure. And the first speaker is Mr. Milan Zver. 2 minutes. Sir, you have the floor.
Hvala za besedo, spoštovani gospod predsedujoči. Moji kolegi so.
Thank you very much, President. My colleagues have said everything that needs to be said and has quoted all of the relevant figures. I have to say that the member states have to play a major role with their programs, including Erasmus. Certain things need to be restructured. We shouldn't just help refugees going to Europe, but other young people as well, young people in Ukraine. The decisive role for us is that we help those young people so that they can survive and get an education. We have good education systems in Slovenia and Europe which could help. In Slovenia, we've already taken in refugees. Children have started school the day after they arrived in children have learned to speak a couple of words of Slovenian the day after they arrived in Slovenia. That's important. We must expand Erasmus not just within Europe and the EU, but also extend it to Ukraine, where young people are still living and need our help.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Maria Grappini. 2 minutes. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues. First of all, let me thank Romanian citizens, but also Polish citizens, Moldovan, Czech citizens, and so on, citizens who in countries that have welcomed refugees. And we're talking about a very important issue. We talked about it in Libe and Deve as well. And last night, Madam Commissioner, I couldn't ask you this, but I will ask you now. Of course, children are our future, and we need to be protected, regardless of their nationality. And here we talk about Ukrainian children. No, we need to treat all children the same. We can't have any double standards for children from Afghanistan, Africa, Syria. No matter what, children are our future. This is why I believe that we need to protect them all, and their nationality doesn't matter. Another thing, Madam Commissioner, just like you said in our committee, is that the countries that carry the biggest burden have their own problems, and we need funding. We need funding to fix this. In Romania, we have our own poor children. Of course, we need to welcome the refugee children coming from Ukraine, but it is unfair that we cannot give them what they need. And apart from structures and platforms and so on, solidarity, we need money. And Madam Commissioner, I want to ask you something, because I was listening to what's been said today, and there's no talk about a third option of stopping this horrendous death of millions of citizens. Of course, sanctions against Russia and help for the refugees, but what about the diplomatic way? Is it still, is everyone still using it? The European institutions, the UN, the US, NATO have a historic responsibility in order to do everything they can on a diplomatic level to put an end to this horror. This is horrific not only for Ukraine, but Romania is asking what's going on. When will the war stop? And it's a danger for all of us, and we need to not forsake the diplomatic way. And tell us what to answer to our citizens when they ask us about the war. Thank you.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Ďalší.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Mr. Andrews, 2 minutes. Sir, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President and Commissioners and colleagues. It's difficult to add something new at the end of a debate, but I want to add my voice of shock at the evidence of war crimes that we've seen over the weekend and that have been very articulately expressed by so many colleagues. I want to raise one issue, which is the criticism of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is triggered by the decision by Peter Moore to visit Sergei Lavrov in Moscow 10 days ago. And photographs that emerged of Mr. Moore seemingly smiling with Mr. Lavrov, and the decision to open an office in Rostov, just inside the Russian, across the Russian border. And we had an engagement with members of the Rada, Inna Sobsun and Halina Yanchenko, and their criticism of the ICRC was palpable and very understandable, because clearly Russia has carried out breaches systematically of international humanitarian law, whether it is collective punishment, whether it is summary executions, as we saw in Bucha, whether it is the targeting of civilian infrastructure. So that criticism is very, very understandable. Nevertheless, it is clear that the ICRC are mandated very clearly by the Geneva Convention and its first protocol to observe the humanitarian principles, which means impartiality, independence, neutrality and humanity. And that is a very difficult thing for the ICRC to do, and it's very difficult for members of the Rada to accept. So my recommendations are twofold. First of all, that the ICRC should be a lot more sensitive in the circumstances where there is clearly an asymmetric approach to respect for international humanitarian law, where the Russian side have been so systematically in breach. And I recommend that DG ECHO would, if possible, open a dialogue between leadership of the Ukrainian Rada and the ICRC on the other hand, in order to find a way for mutual understanding. Thank you, Mr. President.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Bogdan Zoncha. 2 minutes. Sir, you have the floor. pani komisarz.
President, Commissioners, this is a very good debate. Thank you very much. And it's a very important resolution as well. But I think that we should already start preparing another resolution about the fact that we have to start an investigation into what the Russian barbarians are doing in Ukraine. We do have Europol, Eurojust, we have the Hague Tribunal, we have the prosecution office in Ukraine. All these institutions should start working together in order to hunt down the bandits who are killing innocent children and innocent mothers in Ukraine. I think that this resolution should be adopted by acclamation, and the International Criminal Court, which has only given 3 judgments so far in 20 years, should not have mercy on these perpetrators, because there is a lot of evidence that these Russian barbarians are killing innocent children. Thank you.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Ďalšia vystúpi pani Katarína.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Madam Katerina Knichi. 2 minutes. You have the floor.
Grazie Presidente. Durante il mio intervento.
Thank you very much, President. During my contribution of 1 or 2 minutes, I'd like to say that there are a lot of children who are being forced to flee, being forced to leave their own homes, children who are traumatized, who are vulnerable, especially those who come from institutions, from hospitals, children with disabilities, war orphans, minors in general. They run the risk of ending up in the clutches of smugglers. I know that we have to protect the young, but I'd like to point out that I was the first to sign the resolution in the European Parliament concerning children who are fleeing war. It's a resolution that was pushed by the Intergroup for Young People. I'm the co-chairman of that group, and I think we need to undertake greater efforts. We need to make sure there are humanitarian corridors in place. We need to provide psychosocial support. We need to provide guardians for unaccompanied minors, mechanisms to make sure there's accommodation in various member states and access to education systems. These are just a few of the measures that the European institutions and national member states institutions need to take immediately, now, to protect children. Children are the first victims of an absurd war.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Madame Beata Kempa. 2 minutes. Madam, you have the floor.
Panie Przewodniczący, dziękuję.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, until the Ukrainian children and women are safe, until Putin receives his petrodollars, nothing will stop him. I agree with Mr. Jońca. We need a way to persecute Russian criminals. Polish law enforcement is now collecting evidence from children. These children are being deprived of their childhood, and in Poland right now 1,222 children are in Polish hospitals. We have also received a number of children with disabilities. They are now safe in Poland. We are also helping in Ukraine. I visited Lviv this weekend. We provide help, and everybody wants us to stop Putin. and they give us thanks. And finally, a very important last-minute thing. Some 400 exploited children ask for rehabilitation and psychological help abroad. The Commissioner also mentioned specific funds, and for example, Poland is using the state budget, and individual people are helping. But we also need European funds. Thank you for this debate. We have to stop Putin and protect the children.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Markus Rost. 2 minutes. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. How would you feel if your children didn't go to school for a month? What consequences would this have on their schooling? This is actually happening to millions of children fleeing from the horror of war in Ukraine. Our obligations go beyond words. We need concrete action which will help those who have left everything behind. A fundamental issue when a child is developing is their education. Every day a child doesn't go to school, doesn't play with their classmates and interact with their teacher is a lost day for their future. It's a lost day for Europe's future too. The European Union must ensure that refugee children can have their right to learn. We need more teachers, more teaching material, better infrastructure. Schools and centres must be able to welcome children with dignity. So we need the right infrastructure, we need investment, we need staff, we need European funds. In addition, we need to focus on recognising diplomas and academic titles. Many Ukrainian students and Ukrainian young people are already at university, and when they're fleeing from the bombs, they don't think about grabbing their university degree or their university certificates. So then they have a problem getting their qualifications recognised. We need to make it easier for their qualifications to be recognised. What is the Commission going to do on that subject? The war shouldn't prevent young Ukrainians from having a future. Thank you very much.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much indeed. The next speaker is Mr. Victor Egrescu. 2 minutes. So you have the floor.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, Madam Commissioner, the situation is dire. 1.8 million children fled Ukraine, 2.5 million children internally displaced in Ukraine. We're talking about 60% of children in Ukraine. These are destinies, people, children who need our help, and we cannot turn a blind eye to this. It's not enough to talk about access to schooling, to healthcare, and so on. We need to do something. We need to do something together, and we need a minimum basic services for these children. And for this, we need money. We need common action at the EU level, and we cannot leave this burden on some member states. Some member states, including Romania, that I represent here in the EU, have done a lot, put in a lot of effort, but we need to do more. We need to come together with all our efforts, and at the level of the EU budget, we asked for common resources for these challenges. And in order to be able to give an integrated help to these children, just like we said before, regardless whether we're talking about access to education, access to housing, to healthcare, there are lots of things that need to be done, not just right now, but over the long term. And Madam Commissioner, I'd like to thank you for your efforts to find a solution to this with the member states, and I'd like that member states, especially those who contribute more to the budget of the EU, to do more. And the Council is not here for this important debate. And this is why we should go further. And I was at the border just like other colleagues, and I've done a lot to help children. We all need to come together because the rights of children are human rights. Thank you.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Dominic Ruiz de Vesa. 2 minutes, so you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, President. I also thank Commissioner Johansson for being here and for her address. More than 1 million Ukrainian children are now on European soil. We don't know how long the conflict is going to last. Their right to education must be safeguarded, whatever happens. However, it's also important to point out that all refugee children deserve this education if they're fleeing from war. It doesn't matter if they're Syrian, Afghan, Ukrainian, or any other nationality. African students living in Ukraine who are also fleeing from war have been instead sent to detention centres in Poland. That means that they are not able to continue with their lives or with their students in Poland or elsewhere in the Union. In Poland, there have been entire Syrian families with young children who have also been detained in some of the border camps between Belarus and the EU. We can't have an EU system based on discrimination, which is hypocritical. We have to ensure that all refugee rights are upheld, children's too, but every single age range. For this to happen, we need a European assistance plan so that we can provide support to the millions of refugees in Europe, but also so that we can deal with the energy crisis, the energy price hike, and what we need as to ensure our defense, and so that we can help Ukraine with its heroic defense of its country and its territorial integrity. Thank you.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. A na záver...
Thank you very much. And in conclusion, on behalf of the European Commission...
Благодаря. В заключение от името на Европейската комисия.
We'll hear from Ylva Johansson.
Ylva Johansson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. What makes us human? I think it's the ability to imagine, to realize the reality of another human being, to feel her fear, to feel her suffering, to feel her hope, her love. I would like to thank you all for this very good debate. I would like to thank you for your engagement and solidarity, as well as your readiness to act. Ukrainian parents want us, count on us, to protect their children while they are out fighting for their country, for our shared European values. And I know that I can count on you in the European Parliament in this effort. Many of you have mentioned education. Just to answer some of the questions, through cohesion funds, we help integration into kindergartens, into schools, including language courses. We are ready also from the Commission side to publish school books in Ukrainian and to support technology providers to develop digital educational content. Already today, this morning, more than 160 Ukrainian refugee children went to school in an EU member state. And this, of course, we need to step up. 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainian Minister of Interior, Denis Monastyrsky, spoke to the Extraordinary Council, JHA Council, with the Ministers of Interior. He told us about the terrible numbers of reports of children witnessing their fathers being killed, their mothers being raped again and again and again. Many of you have spoken about these terrible war crimes. I want to tell you that the EU has set up a joint investigation team with Ukraine to collect evidence and investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity. The EU stands ready to send investigation teams on the ground to support the Ukrainian prosecution services. And as I mentioned earlier, both Eurojust and Europol stand ready to assist. And as I also told you in the beginning, the protection and support to the refugee children are at the top priority of my 10-point plan that is going to guide the Commission's work the coming weeks. Again, thank you very much for this very good debate. Thank you for your engagement and thank you for your readiness to act. This is what we need now to protect children in war. Thank you.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much. That brings...
Благодаря много. Очакваме вашите предложения за изменения. Ще гласуваме в четвъртък. Следващата
енергетическа инфраструктура.
The next debate is on trans-European energy infrastructure.